All right, so first of all, I thought I would just share a little bit about my background. Here we go. So I've been working in transportation planning and policy for the last 23 years, specializing in integrated planning and economics and return on investment. I've worked 22 of those years, various assignments with the state of Mississippi and Mississippi DOT. I do have a PhD in economics, and so I come at transportation from an economic development lens, thinking about it as a means to an end. How does it support our economy and our quality of life? In terms of Mississippi, I've worked with them on their last three multimodal long-range plans. As part of that effort, we actually go out and we look at your multimodal network, at the existing conditions. We forecast what the future needs are going to be, the future demand and the future need on that network over a 20-year period. And then we look at what revenue is going to be required to make sure that you meet your overall performance targets. For that. As part of that, we do a long-term revenue forecast. And so through that experience, we've really been able to gather a lot of information about the various needs of the state, as well as the revenue and the shortage of revenue. And so that's what I'm going to be drawing from that experience. In addition to the long-range plan, I've also done a lot of work around the state, around freight and logistics planning, helping them with their state freight plan. I've done statewide rail plans and statewide port plans. So I've been to a lot of nooks and crannies throughout the state. So Mississippi's been very good to me throughout my career, and I've always enjoyed working here. So what I wanted to talk with you about today, I thought I'd start with really kind of observations from MDOT's long-range transportation plans as we've done those over the years, and what's changed and really what hasn't changed. Talk about some of the performance and the conditions with a focus on your roadways over time, and then look at the current transportation funding and talk about some options for future funding. And then really what's at stake if we don't address the gap in transportation funding. So as most of you probably are aware, MDOT operates and maintains, they do not operate and maintain every single mileage of roadway, but they do operate and maintain all of the interstate miles, plus nearly 3,400 miles, or 93% of the mileage that's on the national highway system, and nearly 1,100 miles, or 49% of all the roads that are eligible for funding under the federal aid highway system programs. So whenever you look at that, they may not maintain and operate all of the roadways, but they do take care of the ones that are most critical. 90% of your commercial vehicle miles traveled are done so on roads that are operated and maintained by MDOT, and 60% of your passenger vehicle miles traveled. So while they don't maintain all of the system, they maintain the most critical parts and the parts that carry the highest volumes of traffic. So as you look at the travel demand, this comes from the last completed plan. We are in the process of updating the long-range plan, and so we'll have newer numbers toward the end of the year. But whenever we look at this, this was projecting out to 2045. There was a projected increase of about 33% in terms of your vehicle miles traveled, and that's a measure of the overall demand on your highway system. But there was about a 37% increase in your vehicle hours traveled. So what that's telling us is that if your hours are increasing faster, at a faster rate than the miles traveled, then that means your congestion is increasing. It's taking you longer to make those trips. And so that's what we're seeing through the statewide travel demand model and those projections. And this is driven by both the projections for population and employment and other types of economic activity. So at the same time, this means that there is a need for added capacity, and this is important to understand. The graph here, the one that's going to be on your left, shows the mileage by county, and you can see there that there's 10 counties that really comprise the highest amount of mileage that's going to be needed. The one on the graph on your left shows a measure called level of service, and this is really a measure of the congestion. So if it's green, then that means you're pretty much free flow and you have very little, if any, congestion. As you start to get into the gold, you start to see moderately congested roadways, and then as you get into the orange and the red, that's when you start to see highly congested roadways, and congestion last throughout long periods of the day. And as you can see, moving from the projections from 2013 over to 2045 is that you're going to have less and less of that mileage that is actually green and free flowing, and more that's going to be experiencing congestion, and particularly your highest growth areas there when you're highly congested areas. The reason this is an issue is because of the last 3 long-range transportation plans that we have done for MDOT. There's been no money in those plans for congestion relief, for capacity projects. It's taken all of the money to maintain your existing systems in terms of your pavement conditions and your bridge conditions, because there are federal targets that you must meet with regards to the percentage of your pavement that is in fair or better condition and the percentage that is allowed to be in poor condition. If you don't meet those federal targets, then you put those federal dollars at risk. And so you spend your money to meet those targets first. And in these long-range plans, that meant that there's been little to nothing left for capacity projects. So the revenues really are not keeping pace with this increase in the demand, and this is just 2 examples, one from the Multi-Plan 2040, the last from the Multi-Plan 2045. We do funding scenarios here where we look at our expected funding, and that is based off our long-term revenue forecast. We assume that the revenues that we have going forward are going to be the same sources that we have now, and we forecast what those revenues will be generating. And in every case, there's always been a gap. So in 2040, whenever you looked at the gap, there was about a $500 million per year gap in terms of meeting your expected revenue versus what was adequate. And adequate was just not to meet all of your needs, but it was to meet the federal and the MDOT, the statewide targets that you had in terms of your bridges, in terms of your pavement, in terms of your safety and your capacity spending, and maintaining what spending you had on your other modes through your multimodal funds. And then whenever we looked at Multi-Plan 2045, which was completed in 2018-2019 timeframe, here you're looking at, this is just looking at your pavement gap alone, and you were going to have a $380 million gap in terms of what you were going to need just to meet your targets for your pavement. And this was really focused on keeping your interstate and your national highway system targets met. But if you looked at your 2-lane NHS facilities, that's where you really started to see a big gap in the performance in those, and there were going to be upwards of 60 to 70% of those mileage that were going to be in poor conditions under the existing revenue streams. And so MDOT found that they had some very tough choices to make. And as we looked at this, our estimates were that you would go from about 179 bridges, which at the time that this multi-plan was completed, being rated as being structurally obsolete or structurally deficient or functionally obsolete, to having 490 bridges on your state system being so. You were going to go from having 60% of your pavement in fair or better condition to only having 47% of your pavement in fair or better condition. And these infrastructure trade-offs have real economic costs to them. And so it results in real economic losses. So it was estimated that it would add about another 205 million hours of delay because of increased congestion and the lack of capacity spending. There would be 472 million gallons of wasted fuel and 28 metric tons of additional CO2 emissions. And all of this has economic impacts as well. So those additional hours of delay and wasted fuel would cost about $5.2 billion to the citizens, workers, and visitors to the state, and that would generate a loss of about over 33,000 jobs, fewer jobs to be had, and about 3.2 million in terms of your, billion in terms of your gross state product, which is really the size of your economy, meaning that you're not going to be growing as fast as you could or should, and about 3.6 billion in terms of personal income. And so this means it's going to cost every Mississippian more out of their pocket, both in terms of their overall transportation costs and the cost of owning a vehicle, but also just in terms of lost economic opportunities. And so if we go to look at performance and conditions over time, despite these tough times and the big gap that they had in terms of funding, MDOT has been able to make some improvements in terms of the infrastructure condition over time. So whenever you look at the pavement conditions, if overall in general, they've been steadily improving. So the amount that are ranked fair or good has been increasing in terms of your interstate pavement, and the amount, the mileage of your interstate pavement that's rated as poor has decreased over time. And this is a chart showing from 2014 going out to 2023. And this comes from the MDOT. They have to submit a biannual performance report to the federal government on these federal performance measures, showing the progress that they're making in terms of meeting and maintaining those performance targets. Whenever you look at non-interstate national highway system, the news isn't quite as good. You've seen that there's been a trade-off between, in order to try to meet those targets with your poor pavement, you've been addressing some of your poorer pavements, but you've been, that means that you have some that have been fallen, the percentage from good has decreased, but the percentage in terms of those rated fair has increased. So there's been a little bit of trade-off there between your good and your fair pavements. Same thing, whenever you look at the bridge conditions, those have also been facing some trade-offs. So MDOT has been able to reduce the number of bridges in poor conditions, and so you can see there going from about 2.3% to about 1.4% over this time period. And so that's been really good. But again, the trade-off has been that you've seen a decrease of the bridges that are rated as good condition, while an increase of those rated in fair condition. But that trade-off was necessary in order to get the number of those that are rated as poor down. So in terms of your current transportation funding, you probably have all seen this report. It comes from the MDOT's annual report, and this is 2023, and it shows where the monies are coming from. So again, still heavily dependent upon federal funding, which is also heavily reliant upon the federal motor fuel tax. And then the part of the state portion, once again, you're also heavily reliant upon the fuel tax. So in the state of Mississippi, that's currently at 18%. It matches the federal rate. There's another 0.4% that goes for environmental cost. And then in addition to that, you will see that you do have some sales tax. You have some other receipts. There's some other taxes that are linked to transportation, such as your commercial vehicle fees, taxes and fees, and then some of your lubricating oil tax. But you'll see a pretty small portfolio of taxes that are going in to fund transportation currently. And so how does the state compare? So this is showing as of 2023, the states in terms of where you are, and you'll see that Mississippi is one of 5 states, which is less than 20 cents per gallon on that. In addition to this, there were 7 states that as of July 2024 had another increase in terms of their motor fuel tax. So you have seen more states stepping up to the plate and actually increasing the state motor fuel tax, because there's been such a resistance at the federal level to do so. So for Mississippi, you do have the second lowest motor fuel tax in the U.S. And so how long has it been since your state has raised the motor fuel tax? You'll see there that Mississippi is standing out. So it was in the 80s, the last time that it's been raised, and that really only lags Alaska, who has not raised it. So some of the threats, the funding threats and the influences, whenever you think about the way in which Mississippi is currently funding transportation, there's an over-dependence on motor fuel tax revenue, and we know that that's been degrading over time due to several reasons. There's been increased fuel mileage, and that's been required by federal requirements in the EPA that you have to get more miles per gallon. And so that has actually made it cheaper to drive, and so the demand has gone up. And there's also been the adoption of electric vehicles, and while Mississippi is a state that kind of lags the nation as a whole in adopting those, they are being adopted, and the more that those are adopted, not only electric vehicles, but other electric vehicles as well in terms of, and you start to think about some of the drone deliveries and other alternative deliveries that are also using electric and not motor fuel. And then there's just the erosion from inflation as well. So the cost of maintaining has gone up at the same time that the tax base has really started to decrease. And so that has destabilized really the motor fuel tax over time. And then the uncertainty of federal funding too. We did have the bipartisan infrastructure law, or IIJA, and we saw a significant increase in funding. And so there's a lot of discussion about will they be able to maintain that level of funding going forward. And so that's increased that uncertainty, because once again, it is also really dependent upon the federal motor fuel tax. And so the same base that's being eroded at a state level is being eroded at that national level as well. And then the reliance on one-time transfers. A lot of states have seen and witnessed budget surpluses and everything, and transportation's been a big beneficiary of budget surpluses, just as it has been here in the state of Mississippi. However, the uncertainty of those transfers makes multi-year planning and construction very difficult. It makes it hard to really develop a program. And it really makes the industry hesitant to really invest without that committed level of revenue coming in. So while it's nice to have and it can move specific projects along and everything, it is not really sufficient to build a long-term program, especially one like in Mississippi, where you've had long sustained gaps in funding. So what are some of the options for future funding? Well, it really comes down to, when you're investing in the future, you can dedicate existing revenue. And so if you're running revenue surpluses, are there some existing revenues that can really be tied to the transportation network and the maintenance and the expansion of that network that you could then dedicate long-term to that? You could look at your existing revenue sources and the current rates, and does it make sense to increase the current rates on existing sources? And then you can look and see, are there other new fees or sources that we should look at enacting? And so as you're looking at dedicated existing revenue, a couple things really pop up in the state of Mississippi. You have your lottery funds that you have, and lottery's done very well here. And so there is a current cap of $80 million on that to go to DOT. So you could look at removing that cap or expanding what that cap is. However, those lottery funds are also set to sunset for DOT. So you might want to look at eliminating that sunset. For the last long-range planning effort we did, we had a scenario which we called the enhanced revenue, where we did extend that permanently throughout the forecast range, and it does make a difference. It does help. So, and then you could also look at your sales tax there and say, you know, are there some sales tax that we might want to dedicate, such as on automobiles or auto-related parts? We have seen some states, such as Georgia, take that route, and so auto parts and other sales that are related directly to driving in the vehicle, the sales tax are now dedicated over to transportation. You could also look at increasing existing rates, given the fact that Mississippi has the second lowest, and you haven't raised it in quite some time. You could look at increasing the motor fuel tax. If you were to increase that to what the national average, which is 33 cents per gallon, according to the EIA, Mississippi sold about 1.7 billion gallons of gasoline and about 750 million gallons of diesel in 2023. Raising your motor fuel tax rate to the national average could result in about 370 to 375 million additional revenue annually for transportation. You could index the motor fuel tax to inflation, index it to the CPI to offset the increasing cost of construction. And so that way, as the cost of construction goes up, then also the motor fuel tax could go up as well. And then you could also look at increasing the sales tax rate. A 1 cent increase would result in about $420 million in revenue. Of course, that's across the board. Some potential new sources of revenue, road user charges. This is something that these are mileage-based fees, and so you pay a fee based on the number of miles that you drive. There have been some successful pilots that have been conducted out there. I think Oregon is the one that most folks have heard about. Oklahoma, another rural state, has also conducted a pilot and shows that they can go, especially through a transition phase. It is feasible to have a motor fuel tax set up along with the road user charges, and there's a lot of strategies to overcome some of the challenges and some of the opposition to that. There's also the potential for a national road user charge pilot that has been tossed around, and so there is expectation that we'll see more activity in the road user charge arena over the next 2 to 4 years. Package delivery fees are also something that states are looking at. Colorado was the first to implement. They implemented it in 2023. It was 27 cents at the time. It's increased to 28 cents per package, and it raised about $98 million. Minnesota also implemented one as of, it's a 50-cent package delivery fee, and that was as of July the 1st. That's on anything delivered over $100, packages over $100. There are some exceptions for small businesses doing under a certain dollar value of sales within the state to help protect the small businesses. In the beginning, Colorado had where it had to be passed on to the consumers and it had to be shown in their bill. They have since said that the retailers themselves can actually pay the tax. But if it is passed on, that it does have to be itemized within the bill. Minnesota is putting the burden on the retailers to actually pay the fee. Public-private partnerships. This is primarily looking at using tolling for new capacity and leveraging some upfront private capital to actually expand the program. Tennessee just recently passed the Transportation Modernization Act, and it gave them a wide range of authority in terms of entering into public-private partnerships. And then as a result of that and a $3 billion transfer from the general fund, they totally restructured their 10-year program to make it a fiscally constrained 10-year program to get all of their major projects paid for. This would have somewhat limited capability here within the state of Mississippi. Typically, the public-private partnerships and that private capital are going to be in your higher growing urban areas where you can actually justify tolling and there's enough congestion where people would pay for tolls for large periods of the day. There's also the possibility of development impact or utility fees, and so these are statewide impact fees that are based on forecasted future travel demand, and they're placed on the developers. So large industrial developments, a lot of warehousing and distribution, they're going to generate a lot of truck traffic, so you are starting to see some states look at this possibility. You've had these at the local level for some time, traffic impact fees, but now they're looking at it as a potential for state fees as well. And then there's also some states with deep water ports looking at container or cargo fees, and these are fees based primarily on import cargo coming in, and a lot of times these are using your roadways and they are getting to destinations outside of Mississippi. Once again, your ability to raise these are going to be dependent upon the amount of cargo coming in through your ports and making sure that you don't damage the competitiveness of those ports at the same time. So it really is a diversified approach, or what most states are looking at now, because they're seeing the implications of being overly reliant on a single source of revenue. And so if you take a diversified approach where you're using several different sources to fund transportation, but also as you're thinking about new revenues, maybe a diversified approach in terms of a combination of allocating existing revenue, looking at raising existing rates, and maybe potentially adding new fees. This really enhances the sustainability and the adequacy of the funding over time. It also can help to improve the equity and the fairness so that you don't go to a overly regressive tax system for transportation. And it can also help to support the long-term growth and the need. So as your state grows and in the areas that it grows, then your revenue for funding the transportation that's needed can also grow. So if you fail to meet the transportation gap, then what's at stake? Well, failure to invest has definite consequences in terms of your people and your citizens. It reduces the mobility and your access to education, to healthcare, and to jobs. It's something that we hear all the time when we're out interviewing stakeholders in the private sector, is they want more and better access to their places of employment. They need to expand the reach to make sure that they can meet the workforce. There are workforce challenges across the nation, and Mississippi is no different. It lowers the overall quality of life. No one likes sitting in traffic. No one likes being late to their kids' baseball games or picking them up for daycare or those important events that we have. And it increases the cost of auto ownership, which increases the cost of living and the cost of doing business. In terms of your economy, it does increase that cost of living and the cost of doing business across the state. And then we know that quality infrastructure is really, and transportation infrastructure is always one of your top 3 business location factors whenever they're looking at. So not only do they need access to interstates and highways, they want access to good interstates and highways. And then finally, your infrastructure. Failure to meet your federal performance targets, as I noted earlier, endangers federal monies. Higher future transportation replacement costs. So we know that those costs are only going to go up. So the more we delay this, the more it's going to cost us in the future. And then it also increased the risk of infrastructure failure. We've seen our fair share of infrastructure failure across the U.S. And so this delayed maintenance and repair and failure to keep our infrastructure in a state of good operating repair has led to many of those failures. And then adequately funding transportation can pay for itself. So in the last long-range plan, we looked at what if you adequately funded it to meet all of the federal performance targets as well as Mississippi's performance targets. And so it would pay off with a saving of nearly $4.7 billion that are attributed to avoiding your delay in your vehicle delay, travel time delay, as well as your operating costs. It means that you could be more competitive and attract more industry here, increasing and expanding employment by over 30,000 full-time jobs. And then also increasing your overall size of your economy by $2.9 billion and expanding personal income by $3.6 billion. So overall, there's consequences if you don't adequately fund transportation, but chances are if you do, that the investments are going to start to pay for themselves. So with that, I would like to turn it over to the chairmen and open it up for questions or comments.